Family is supposed to mean safety. A mother and a father are supposed to be the first wall between a child and everything that could ever do them harm. They are the ones who lock the doors at night. They are the ones who teach a child to fear the stranger, the dark road, the car that slows near the school. They are the ones who stand in the doorway and refuse to move. But for the parents in these cases, the danger was never outside. It was already inside the house. Raised at their own table, sleeping down their own hall, wearing the face of a daughter. They were asleep in their own beds. They were stepping out of the shower. They were sitting at their own kitchen tables. The plans their children laid, the scenes they staged afterward, and how close each of them came to walking away clean, are what bind these stories together. Today, we are covering 10 daughters who killed their parents and nearly escaped. Case 1. Sarah Johnson. It was the early morning of Tuesday, the 2nd of September 2003, in Bellevue, Idaho, a small town set in the narrow green corridor of the Wood River Valley, a short drive south of the ski resorts at Sun Valley and the town of Haley. The kind of place where people move for the quiet, where the mountains press in on both sides of the road, and the loudest sound on most nights is the wind moving through dry grass. Inside a modest single-story home off a quiet road, 16-year-old Sarah Marie Johnson lived with her mother, Diane, and her father, Alan Scott Johnson. A guest house on the property was rented to a local electrician named Mel Spiegel, who was out of town that week. Sarah's older half-brother, Matthew, had already left for the University of Idaho in Moscow, most of a day's drive to the north. So the house that morning held 3 people, a mother, a father, and their teenage daughter. By the time the sun was fully up over the valley, both of those parents would be dead inside that home, shot within minutes of each other, and Sarah would be at a neighbour's door, telling them that a stranger had broken in and killed her mother and father. For a short while, that was the version everyone believed. Sarah had been born on the 24th of January 1987, and she attended Wood River High School over in Haley. Accounts of the family from that period differ on a few small points. Some describe Diane as working at a local medical clinic, others as a county tax collector, while Alan is most often tied to a landscaping and garden business. Sources also give their ages as 52 for Diane and 46 for Alan, though the exact figures shift a little depending on the telling. What does not shift is the picture of a settled, middle-class home with 2 working parents and a teenage girl who, on paper, had every reason to be safe in her own bed. By 2003, Sarah had been seeing a 19-year-old named Bruno Santos. He was a high school dropout, and around Bellevue he carried a reputation for drugs and a rougher crowd than her parents wanted anywhere near their daughter. Alan and Diane did not approve, and they were not quiet about it. They took away Sarah's car. They set limits on where she could go and who she could see. After they learned that Sarah had lied about staying at a friend's house when she had actually been with Santos, her parents reached the end of their patience and raised the possibility of going to the police, since Sarah was a minor and Santos was an adult, which opened him to a statutory charge. That was the fracture. Plenty of teenagers go to war with parents who disapprove of a boyfriend, sneak out and lie about where they have been. Almost none of them cross from that ordinary friction into planning a killing. Somewhere in the weeks before that September morning, by the account the state would later prove to a jury, Sarah crossed it. The threat to her relationship and the threat hanging over Santos became something she decided to remove rather than wait out. She has never accepted that account, and that disagreement runs through the entire case to this day. But it is the version a jury heard and believed. The state's theory reached past a teenager guarding a romance. Prosecutors argued that Sarah acted to stop her parents from carrying out threats that could have put Santos behind bars on a statutory charge, or seen him removed from the country, which would have taken him out of her life either way. The pieces that mattered were already on the property. In the rented guest house, the electrician Mel Spiegel kept a rifle, a .264 caliber weapon, and Sarah knew it was there. In the days right before the killings, she had been inside that guest house, something witnesses later established, and she had access to the key. There was also one small, almost domestic detail from that morning that ended up carrying enormous weight. The household garbage was due to be collected that Tuesday. Sarah, by the testimony at trial, became visibly upset when she learned the pickup had been halted, that the cans would not be emptied as expected. At the time, it would have read as a teenager annoyed about a chore. Later, it became one of the threads that helped convict her, because of what had been placed in that garbage can and what was supposed to happen to it. In the early window of that morning, between roughly 6:20 and 7, while her father was in the shower and her mother was still in bed, Sarah carried the rifle into the house. To keep blood and gunshot residue off her body, she pulled a shower cap over her blonde hair and put on a pink plush bathrobe, which she wore backward so the opening faced behind her, along with gloves. She walked into the master bedroom where Diane was lying down and shot her sleeping mother in the head at close range. Diane never had the chance to wake fully, to sit up, to understand what was happening in her own bedroom in the first minutes of an ordinary day. She was 52 years old. Alan heard the shot. He came out of the shower to find out what had happened in his own home, and he met his daughter holding the rifle. She shot him in the chest, above the heart. Sources differ on whether he was struck once or twice, but the outcome did not differ. Alan, in his mid-40s, died near the bathroom of the house he had bought to keep his family safe, killed by the child he and Diane had raised. Two parents were dead within minutes, in a home with no sign of forced entry, because the person who killed them already lived there and already held a key to everything on the property. What came next was built to make it all point somewhere else. To suggest that outsiders had done this, Sarah placed knives at the foot of her parents' bed and in her brother Matthew's empty room. She took the scope off the rifle and set it on Mel Spiegel's bed in the guest house, leaving the rest of the weapon behind, so that suspicion might fall on the tenant or on the violent strangers her boyfriend was rumoured to know. The door to her parents' bedroom was found propped open with two pillows, an arrangement that fit a scene assembled with time and thought far better than it fit a stranger fleeing a house. Then she stripped off the protective layer she had worn, got rid of it, and went out of the house. She ran to a neighbour, Kim Richards, who opened her door to a screaming teenager saying her parents had been shot. Emergency services were called, the first responders and the first investigators arrived to a genuine horror. Two murdered adults and a surviving 16-year-old daughter who appeared to be the lone witness to a home invasion. For the opening stretch of the investigation, that framing held. A distraught girl taken to the station, telling officers she had been asleep in her room when she heard gunshots, that she had gone to her parents' room, found them, panicked, and run for help. Across the early interviews, she gave several different accounts of what she had been doing, what she had seen, and what she had heard, though in every version she had left the room either just before the second shot or in the moment right after it. A story that kept shifting, told to people trained to listen for exactly that kind of drift, was one more thing that did not hold. The early suspicion still moved toward the people around her. Bruno Santos, the boyfriend, was an obvious figure given his reputation and the parents' threats against him. Mel Spiegel, the tenant whose rifle had been used and whose bed held the planted scope, was another. Both of those leads collapsed for the same reason. The physical evidence would not attach to either man. Investigators could not connect Santos to the scene through any forensic trace, and Spiegel, who had been out of town, produced a solid account of his whereabouts. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing of value had been taken from the home, two facts that sat badly with the idea of strangers breaking in to commit a double murder and then leaving the household otherwise untouched. The evidence, once gathered and tested, was overwhelming, and much of it came from the very effort Sarah had made to stage the scene. In a garbage can in front of the residence, the same garbage that was meant to be hauled away that morning, Police found the pink bathrobe, a latex glove, and a leather glove. The leather glove carried gunshot residue. Its match, the other glove of the pair, was found inside Sarah's own bedroom, and that pair was normally kept in Diane's vehicle, which meant the hands that fired the rifle had reached into her mother's belongings for cover. The bathrobe and gloves carried DNA from both victims and from Sarah herself. The bathrobe also held paint chips that matched paint on the shirt Sarah had been wearing that morning, tying the discarded robe directly to her body. Testimony established that her path out of the house, on the way to the neighbour, took her right past that garbage can, the place where the most damning items had been dumped. Had the collection truck come as scheduled, that evidence might have been gone, and her irritation over the halted pickup suddenly read very differently. Inside her bedroom, the picture only worsened. Police recovered a key to the guest house where the rifle had been kept. They found unspent .264 caliber shells, and on one of them was biological tissue identified as Diane's. They found the magazine of a 9mm handgun wrapped in a bandana. Footprints were observed in the morning dew on the lawn, leading to and from the main house and the guest house, consistent with someone moving between the two structures around the time of the killings. When Sarah was brought in, investigators noted a bruise on her shoulder of the kind a rifle leaves when it recoils against the body of the person firing it. Blood spatter analysis of her bedroom indicated that she had opened her bedroom door after the shooting, which sat in direct contradiction to her claim of sleeping through the gunfire untouched. People close to the family, including her aunt Linda Vavold, later described a girl whose reactions did not match her supposed grief. Her aunt told the court that in the days after the killings, Sarah had seemed more interested in having her fingernails painted than in mourning, and that she would roll her eyes when the adults around her broke down. None of that alone convicts anyone. Stacked on the forensic evidence, it formed the portrait the state carried into court. Once the laboratory work tied her clothing and the discarded gloves to the killings, investigators brought her in one final time, hoping the weight of the findings might draw a confession out of her, but it did not come, and she held to the intruder story she had told from the first morning. On the 30th of October 2003, less than 2 months after the killings, Sarah Johnson was arrested and charged as an adult with the double murder of her mother and father. The trial became a national event. Because of the intense local attention in the Wood River Valley, the proceedings were moved to Ada County in Boise, where they ran for about 5 weeks and were broadcast live by Court TV to an audience that followed every day of testimony. Prosecutors laid out the staged scene, the borrowed rifle, the protective clothing, the planted knives and scope, the discarded evidence in the curbside trash, and the DNA and residue that bound all of it to the 16-year-old who had run to the neighbour crying "intruder." The defence held to Sarah's position, the same one she had taken from the first morning, that an unknown intruder was responsible and that she was an innocent survivor, wrongly accused of her own parents' murders. On the 16th of March 2005, the Ada County jury found her guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. The sentence matched the weight of 2 killings carried out with planning and concealment. Sarah received 2 fixed life terms without the possibility of parole. 2 sentences that, by their own terms, keep a person in prison for the rest of their natural life, with no path to release. And the court added a 15-year enhancement tied to the use of a firearm. She was 18 by the time the verdict came in, sentenced for a crime committed at 16, sent away for the rest of her life for the deaths of the 2 people who had raised her. The case did not end at sentencing, because Sarah has never stopped insisting she did not do it. Her conviction moved through the appeal courts, and on the 26th of June 2008, the Idaho Supreme Court affirmed it. A later proceeding addressed a claim that her original attorney had failed to file an appeal on time, which led to the judgment being formally re-entered so her direct appeal could proceed properly. Through the following years, her case drew the attention of the Idaho Innocence Project, which argued that she had not received adequate legal representation and pressed for new DNA testing of crime scene evidence, including unidentified fingerprints found on the murder weapon. The Idaho Supreme Court rejected those efforts in 2014, finding no convincing showing that her counsel had failed her and ruling that the unidentified prints did not entitle her to a new trial. Further attempts in 2017 were also turned down. At one stage, her representation pursued the argument before the United States Supreme Court that a sentence of life without parole for a crime committed by a 16-year-old raised constitutional concerns about how juveniles are punished. The conviction has stood through all of it. Sarah Johnson remains in prison, held at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center, identified by an inmate number rather than the life she might have had. Across 2 decades of interviews and appeals, she has continued to say that an intruder killed her parents and that she is innocent of their deaths. The courts that have reviewed the evidence have continued to disagree. More than 20 years on, she is in her late 30s, having by now spent more of her life inside an Idaho prison than she ever spent free. Her brother Matthew learned that his parents had been shot through a phone call while he was away at college, a day's travel from home, and in the space of a single Tuesday, he lost his mother, lost his father, and watched his teenage sister become the person convicted of killing them. The home in Bellevue, the guest house, the ordinary chore of a garbage pickup that was supposed to happen and did not. All of it folded into a record that ends with 2 graves and a daughter who, by the judgment of a jury and every court since, planned the whole thing and very nearly sold the story that a stranger had done it. Both parents were alive and ordinary at 6 in the morning on the 2nd of September 2003. Before 7, both were dead, and the only person who could have walked them safely through that morning was the one holding the rifle. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case crosses the Atlantic to a quiet house in Essex in the east of England. There was no break-in and no staged scene this time, because for 4 years there was no crime scene anyone knew about at all. A daughter named Virginia McCulloch killed both of her parents in the family home and then kept them hidden inside it, telling everyone they were still alive. Case 2. Virginia McCulloch. It was the summer of 2019 on a quiet residential street called Pump Hill in Great Baddow, a settled suburb on the southern edge of Chelmsford in the English county of Essex. The kind of street where the houses sit behind low front walls and tidy hedges, where neighbours nod to each other over the recycling bins, and where nothing about any single home gives away what is happening inside it. In one of those houses lived John McCulloch, a 70-year-old retired lecturer who had taught business studies, and his wife Lois, who was 71. Both were in poor health by that summer. Both had come to lean more and more on the daughter who lived with them and looked after them, a woman in her early 30s named Virginia McCulloch. To the neighbours, to the wider family, and to the couple's doctors, Virginia was the devoted daughter who had stayed home to care for 2 aging parents. By the end of that summer, both John and Lois would be dead inside that house, killed by the daughter they had trusted with their care. And for the next 4 years, she would keep their bodies in the rooms where they had died, while telling everyone who asked that they were alive and well. John McCulloch had spent his working life in education, lecturing in business studies, work that had taken him to Anglia Ruskin University before retirement slowed him down. Lois had been his wife for decades and had been at his side through all of it. In a photograph the family later released, the 2 of them stand together in front of a mini golf course, dressed in blue, smiling at the camera. An ordinary retired couple at an ordinary day out. By 2019, their world had narrowed to the house and the daily routines of 2 people whose health was failing, and the person who managed those routines, who handled the appointments and the shopping and the money, was Virginia. A caregiver daughter is one of the most trusted figures in any family. The whole arrangement rests on the assumption that the person closest to the vulnerable is the person protecting them. In this house, that assumption was the cover under which everything else happened. What John and Lois did not fully understand was how much trouble their daughter was in. Behind the picture of the dutiful carer, Virginia had been quietly draining her parents. She had been stealing from them, running up debts on credit cards taken out in their names while they were still alive, and living in the family home without paying her own way. By the time of the killings, the court would later hear, she was close to £60,000 in debt. She had also been covering her tracks with forgery. Investigators found that she had produced fake letters designed to convince her parents that they had lost money through scams, a way of explaining the holes in their accounts that pointed the blame anywhere except at her. Essex police later described the documents recovered from the house as the portrait of a woman desperately trying to stop her parents from discovering the depth of the financial hole she kept digging, while feeding them false reassurances about her own employment and her plans for the future. That was the fracture, and it is the kind of fracture that turns slowly before it turns all at once. A daughter in debt, lying to the people she lives with, forging letters to hide the theft, is already living a double life. What threatens a person in that position is the moment the lies become impossible to keep separate, the moment the deceived party starts to ask the wrong question. For Virginia McCulloch, the calculation that followed was a simple one. As long as her parents were alive, they might find out. The judge who later sentenced her put it plainly, telling her that a substantial motive for each of the murders was to stop her parents from discovering that she had been stealing from them and lying to them, and to keep taking the money that had been meant for them. In June 2019, she acted. The medication she used had not been gathered in a hurry. She had been hoarding prescription drugs, quietly building a supply, which pointed to a plan formed well before the night she finally used it. Hoarding the drugs meant she had been preparing for her father's death across an extended period, gathering the means in advance rather than reaching for them in a single bad moment. She crushed a cocktail of those drugs and slipped them into a drink she gave her father. John McCulloch, 70 years old and already in poor health, was poisoned to death by his own daughter inside the home where he had raised her. That was the first killing. The second came the next day, and it came because of the first. Virginia decided to kill her mother out of fear that Lois would discover what had happened to John. There is some variation in how the sources describe the exact sequence, with one account suggesting she tried to poison both parents and turned to greater violence when her mother survived, while the account given by police and laid out in court is that Lois was killed with a hammer and a kitchen knife, struck and then fatally stabbed. Lois McCulloch was 71 years old. She died in the house she had shared with her husband a day after he did, killed by the same person for the same reason. Virginia later spoke to police about the moment she attacked her mother in terms so casual and so detached that the officers who heard it did not forget it. The words she chose, repeated in court and in the coverage of the case, treated the killing of her own mother as something almost mechanical, and that same detachment runs through everything she did next. In the hours after the killings, Virginia did something that shows how quickly her mind had moved past the act and on to the cover-up. She went into Chelmsford city centre and bought plastic gloves and sleeping bags, and she paid for them using her dead father's bank card. The same card she had been quietly draining for months now funded the materials she would use to hide his body. She returned to the house and set about concealing what she had done. For her father, she built something the court would describe as a homemade mausoleum. She stacked masonry blocks together in his study to form a kind of tomb, and over it she laid blankets and a number of pictures and paintings, so that to a casual eye, the corner of the room looked like clutter rather than a grave. Her mother she wrapped in a sleeping bag and hid in a wardrobe upstairs. Two parents, two hiding places, in two different parts of the same house, both within the walls Virginia would continue to live inside for the next 4 years. What followed was one of the longest sustained deceptions in a modern British murder case. Virginia did not flee. She stayed in the family home, surrounded by the concealed bodies of the two people she had killed, and she built an elaborate, enduring web of lies to explain their absence. She told relatives and friends that her parents were unwell, or away on holiday, or off on lengthy trips. She cancelled family arrangements on their behalf. Because she controlled every line of contact, no one else in the family ever spoke to John or Lois directly in those 4 years. Birthday messages, phone calls, and visit requests all ran through Virginia, and she turned each one aside with another small, plausible lie about a holiday, an illness, or a trip that kept being extended. The arrival of the coronavirus pandemic the following year handed her an unexpected gift. With lockdowns keeping people apart and visits to elderly relatives discouraged or forbidden, the absence of 2 frail pensioners drew far less suspicion than it otherwise might have. The prosecutor told the court that the COVID restrictions had been a stroke of luck for the deception. While the bodies stayed hidden, the money kept flowing out. Virginia continued to spend her parents' pensions after their deaths. She kept using the credit cards in their names. She lived rent-free in the house where she had killed them. Across the 4 years, the financial benefit she drew from the murders came to nearly £150,000, money taken from pensions, from credit cards, and from the sale of assets. Most of it was simply frittered away, including around £21,000 lost to online gambling. Among the assets she sold were possessions that had belonged to her parents, turned into cash while their owners lay dead in the house. The whole point of the killings, by the court's reckoning, had been to protect the theft and to keep the money coming, and once her parents were gone, she did exactly that, while their bodies sat in a study and a wardrobe a few rooms away. The deception held for more than 4 years, and in the end, it was broken by a doctor's appointment that never got kept. By September 2023, the general practitioners who looked after John and Lois had grown concerned. The couple had missed appointments and had not been seen, and the explanations being offered for their continued absence no longer satisfied the people responsible for their medical care. The concern was passed to Essex Police, who went to the house on Pump Hill to carry out a welfare check on 2 elderly patients no one had laid eyes on in a long time. What they found ended the deception in a single afternoon. For 4 years, Virginia had stood as the buffer between her parents and the outside world, the one who answered for them and spoke for them, and the concern raised by their own doctors was the first crack the deception could not paper over. By the time officers entered, the bodies had been concealed for so long that the remains were partly mummified, and establishing how and when each parent had died became painstaking forensic work. The detective inspector who led the case called it a hugely complex investigation, and the force described the inquiry as one of the most challenging its officers had faced. The arrest on the 15th of September 2023 was captured on police body cameras, and the footage shows a woman who had been waiting, in some sense, for this exact moment. Virginia did not resist. She did not deny. She told the officers with an eerie calm that she had known this would come eventually, and that it was right she should serve her punishment. At one point she told them to cheer up, because at least they had caught the bad guy. She then directed them to the concealed bodies of her parents. The body camera footage of that calm confession was later released and widely viewed, and the detail that unsettled people most was her demeanour, untroubled and almost relieved, as though a long performance had finally been allowed to end. The case moved through the courts without the long uncertainty of a contested trial, because Virginia McCulloch admitted what she had done. At an earlier hearing, she had appeared by video link from prison and had been remanded into custody to await sentencing. At a hearing at Chelmsford Crown Court on the 4th of July 2024, she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. The sentencing came on the 11th of October 2024. The judge, Christopher Morgan, told her there was only one sentence the law allowed for murder, a mandatory term of life imprisonment, and that the real question before the court was the minimum term she would have to serve before she could even be considered for release. He worked through the planning behind each killing, the long deceit that followed, and the money she had taken, and he described what she had built as an elaborate, extensive, and enduring web of deceit, grown and maintained over months and years. He set the minimum term at 36 years. A woman in her 30s was told she would be deep into old age before any parole board would so much as look at her case. She showed no emotion as the sentence was passed. The weight of what she had done landed hardest, as it always does, on the people who had loved John and Lois. Lois McCulloch's brother, Richard Butcher, told the court in a victim impact statement that what had happened had undermined his faith in humanity. The simple, devastating admission of a man whose sister and her husband had been taken from him by the calculated choices of their own child. Virginia's sister, Louise Hopkins, later spoke publicly about the impossible position the family had been left in. She said she had forgiven her sister, that she refused to let the bitterness consume her, and at the same time she made clear she would never visit Virginia in prison and was still trying to come to terms with the killings of her parents. Both things were true at once, the forgiveness and the refusal, which is often what survival looks like for the families left behind. The case left a mark on Great Baddow that outlasted the trial. The house itself became an object of grim fascination, to the point that Essex police later investigated a blogger who had got inside and photographed the rooms where the bodies had lain. For the wider community, the hardest part to absorb was how two elderly people could be gone for 4 years while the world around them carried on as though nothing had changed. The case raised harder questions too, about how two pensioners known to their doctors and to a wider family could vanish for so long without any system noticing, when the only person reporting on their welfare was the same person who had killed them. What stays in the public record about Virginia McCulloch is the 4 years. The killings were terrible on their own, and what sits beside them is the length of time she was willing to live alongside the results. For more than 4 years, she ate, slept, and carried on inside a house with her murdered father entombed behind masonry blocks in one room, and her murdered mother wrapped in a sleeping bag in a wardrobe in another. She kept up appearances even at the smallest practical level, maintaining the house and the rhythms of a home that still seemed to hold 3 living people, when in truth it held only 1. She paid for her shopping and her gambling with their money. She told the people who asked after them that they were on holiday. She kept 2 graves in her home and acted every single day as though the people in them were going to walk back through the door. John McCulloch was 70 years old. Lois McCulloch was 71. They had raised a daughter, grown old, and trusted her to look after them at the point in their lives when they could no longer look after themselves. And that trust was the exact instrument she used to end them and to hide it. The house on Pump Hill has been emptied of its terrible secret. The 2 people who lived and died there are buried now where they should have been buried in 2019. The daughter who put them in the ground inside their own home will be an old woman herself, if she lives, before the law ever considers letting her out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to a suburb of Toronto in Canada, and to a daughter who arranged for other people to kill her parents so that her own hands would stay clean. Jennifer Pan let a team of hired men into the family home to stage a robbery, and when the night was over, her mother was dead, her father was fighting for his life, and Jennifer was on the phone to police playing the terrified survivor. Case 3. Jennifer Pan. It was the evening of Monday, the 8th of November 2010, in Markham, Ontario, a settled suburb north of Toronto, where many immigrant families had bought their first homes after years of saving. On a quiet residential street called Helen Avenue stood the home of Hue Ham Pan and his wife, Bic Ha Pan, a couple who had come to Canada separately as refugees from Vietnam in the late 1970s and had built a life here through thrift and long hours. That evening followed the ordinary shape of a weeknight. Bic Ha had come home from her weekly line dancing class. Han had gone to bed early, the way he usually did. Their 24-year-old daughter, Jennifer, spoke briefly with her mother, said goodnight, and went upstairs. To anyone looking in, the Pans were a close immigrant family with a hard-working father, a devoted mother, and an accomplished daughter who had done everything her parents had ever asked of her. Before the night was over, Big Ha Pan would be dead in the basement of that house. Han Pan would be lying beside her with a bullet in his head, and Jennifer would be on the phone to the police, describing a home invasion that had not happened the way she said it had. The accomplished daughter was the centerpiece of the family's pride. Han and Big Ha had poured everything into Jennifer, in the way that parents who arrive with almost nothing often pour everything into a child. She was raised under strict rules, kept away from dances and parties, and steered through piano, figure skating, and martial arts. The plan, in her father's mind, was a respectable profession, ideally pharmacy. By her early 20s, the plan appeared to have worked. To her parents, Jennifer had graduated high school with strong marks, earned a place at university, completed a degree in pharmacology, and taken a job connected to a major children's hospital in Toronto. Each of those milestones was a source of quiet satisfaction in a household built on the idea that sacrifice now buys security later. Almost none of it was real. Jennifer had begun doctoring her report cards as far back as grade 8, altering a first imperfect grade rather than bring it home. The habit hardened into a way of life. When she failed calculus in her final year of high school, she did not graduate, and the early university acceptance she had been offered was withdrawn. Rather than tell her parents, she built a second, fictional version of herself and maintained it for years. She produced forged report cards and a fake diploma. She pretended to attend university to the point that her parents would drop her off at the campus while she went to the library or spent the day elsewhere. She claimed a pharmacology degree she had never earned and a hospital job she had never held. At one stage, a fake university document was bought online for a few $100s to help sell the story. She told her parents she was living part of the week with a female friend, when in fact, she was with a young man named Daniel Wong, the boyfriend they did not know she still had. Wong was the other secret. Jennifer had been involved with him on and off since high school, a relationship that ran for years. He worked in a restaurant and dealt drugs on the side, and he was exactly the kind of presence Han and Big Ha did not want anywhere near their daughter. For a long time, the relationship survived in the gaps of Jennifer's invented life. Then, the invented life collapsed. Her parents discovered that the university, the degree, and the job were fictions, and that their daughter had been deceiving them for years. They responded by tightening every rule they had. They took away her phone and her laptop. They watched her movements. They told her the relationship with Wong was over, and that she would stay home and rebuild her life under their supervision. The home she returned to became, in effect, a place she could not leave on her own terms, with her communication cut off and her days accounted for. That was the fracture, and it is where an ordinary story of family pressure turned into something else. A young woman caught in years of lies, suddenly stripped of her freedom and forbidden the person she wanted, is in a desperate and humiliating position. The vast majority of people in that position endure it, or leave, or let the truth do its damage and live with the wreckage. Jennifer reached for a different exit. As long as her parents controlled her life and her money, the future she imagined with Wong was impossible. By early 2010, she and Wong had begun discussing a way to remove the obstacle, and the obstacle was her parents. The plan that took shape ran through Wong to a man named Lenford Crawford, one of Wong's acquaintances, who agreed to arrange the killing. Sources differ on the exact figure Jennifer promised, with some accounts describing a payment of around $10,000 drawn from her eventual inheritance, and others describing an arrangement of several $1,000s for each parent. What is consistent is that money for the killings was to come from the inheritance she expected once her parents were gone. In the days before the attack, the plan was scouted and set. The man arranging it surveyed the neighborhood around Halloween of 2010, learning the street and the family's routine. On the day itself, a message reached Jennifer that, once the working day was done, it would be game time. On the night itself, the signal was simple. Jennifer would leave the front door unlocked and mark the moment with a light. On the evening of the 8th of November, the household settled into its routine. Bichha returned from line dancing and settled downstairs to read. Han went up to bed. At around 2 minutes past 10, Jennifer turned on the lights in the upstairs study. She had unlocked the front door. A few minutes later, 3 armed men came into the house. One went upstairs and roused Han from bed at gunpoint, walking him down to where his wife was being held. A blanket was placed over the heads of both parents. Jennifer, meanwhile, was tied by the wrists to an upstairs banister with a shoelace, loosely enough that the binding would later raise questions. There is some variation in how the sources describe which men were physically inside the house, and the prosecution's position at the later sentencing was that Wong and Crawford were not present that night and had acted as middlemen, with the gunmen being the men they had recruited. The men took the parents down to the basement, sat them on a sectional couch, and shot them. Bichha Pan was shot multiple times, including a wound to the back of the head, and she died there. Ham Pan was shot in the head and the shoulder. By any reasonable expectation, he should have died as well. He did not. What saved Han Pan, and what eventually unravelled the entire plan, was that he survived a gunshot to the head by going still and feigning death until the attackers left. Once the men had gone, taking some cash with them, he found the strength to get himself out of the basement, bleeding and barely conscious, and out toward help. Upstairs, Jennifer freed herself enough to use her phone and called the emergency line. On that call, she presented herself as a terrified survivor, a daughter who had been tied up and left alive while armed strangers shot her parents. Her father could be heard in the background, alive, the one detail her account had not planned for. In the days that followed, Jennifer played the part of the grieving daughter in full. She attended her mother's funeral and was photographed carrying incense, mourning in public the woman whose death she had arranged, while the plan stayed hidden and the police still treated her as a survivor. For those first hours and days, she was the sympathetic victim of a senseless crime, and had her father died in that basement as the plan intended, she might have remained exactly that. In the first hours, the framing held. The local police treated the case as it appeared, a violent home invasion in a quiet suburb, the family random victims of a robbery turned deadly. Then the inconsistencies began to surface, and they did not stop. There was no clear sign of forced entry into the home. The intruders had left the one person upstairs alive and conveniently able to call for help. The way Jennifer had been bound did not match the way 3 armed robbers would have secured a witness. As detectives looked closer, the supposed victim became the focus. Over a series of long videotaped interrogations, played years later to a jury, Jennifer's account shifted and shifted again. Detectives questioned her for hours across more than one session, and she walked them through how she had managed to dial her phone while bound to the banister. She told more than one version of the night. At one point, she claimed the target of the plan had been herself. The story kept moving because there was no true version of it that left her innocent, and detectives, along with phone records that tied her to Wong and to Crawford, closed the distance with each interview. In time, she was charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. 4 others were charged alongside her, including Daniel Wong. The case went to trial in 2014, and the most powerful witness against Jennifer Pan was her own father. Ham Pan, who had survived a bullet to the head, testified about being woken in his own bed to find a gun pointed at him, and about the night that took his wife. For the jury, the sight of the surviving father describing what had been done to him carried a weight no other testimony could match. In December 2014, the jury found Jennifer guilty of first-degree murder for the death of her mother and attempted murder for the shooting of her father. Her co-accused, Daniel Wong, Lenford Crawford, and David Milvaganam, were convicted of the same charges, while Eric Carty was convicted of conspiracy and given an 18-year sentence. When the verdict was read, Jennifer wept and protested that she had not been given a chance. The sentencing came in January 2015 in a Newmarket courtroom, and the judge described what she had done as an unfathomable betrayal of the people who had loved her most. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years on the murder count and a concurrent life sentence for the attempted murder of her father. The most devastating words in the room came from Han Pan. He had chosen to stay away from the hearing in person, and his statement was read aloud in his absence. In it, he said that although he had survived the attempt on his life, he felt as though he had died that day. He said that when he lost his wife, he lost his daughter at the same time. He added that he hoped Jennifer would one day think about what had happened to her family and become a good and honest person. The family that the lies had been built to protect was gone. Jennifer's younger brother, Felix, later moved away to escape the weight of being a member of the Pan family and was reported to have struggled with depression in the aftermath. The case would have ended there, except that the law was not finished with it. In 2023, the Court of Appeal for Ontario overturned the first-degree murder convictions of Jennifer and 3 of her co-accused. The court found that the trial judge had not properly allowed the jury to consider an alternative version of the plot, specifically the possibility that the intended target had been Han alone rather than both parents, which mattered greatly to how the killing of Bikhar should be classified. The appeal court ordered new first-degree murder trials while leaving the attempted murder convictions in place. In April 2025, the Supreme Court of Canada affirmed that decision, confirming that the murder convictions could not stand as they were and that the question would have to be tried again. In the middle of all this, the case had reached a far larger audience than any courtroom after a widely watched documentary in 2024 brought the story to international attention and renewed public fascination with the golden child who had ordered the deaths of her parents. The retrial did not happen because in March 2026, Jennifer Pan resolved the case with a plea. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the death of her mother. The agreed statement of facts set out a version that the original jury had never been asked to weigh squarely. It stated that Jennifer had plotted to kill her father, and that although her aim had been his death, she ought to have known her mother could be inside the house when the plan was carried out, which left her responsible for the death that followed. The attempted murder conviction for the shooting of her father remained. For the manslaughter, she again received a life sentence, but with a crucial difference from 2015. She is now eligible to apply for parole, with the years she has already served counting toward that timeline. Eligibility sits a long way from release. She has not been freed, and the years ahead may still keep her inside. Yet the door that the original sentence had bolted shut for a quarter century no longer holds in the same way. Her co-accused moved through the same revised path, and the last of them to be dealt with, David Milvaganam, was sentenced in Newmarket in April 2026, also in connection with manslaughter, closing out the legal chapter of a case that had run for more than 15 years. What stays in the public record about Jennifer Pan is the shape of the deception and the size of what it cost. For years, she built a counterfeit life to keep her parents proud, and when that life collapsed, she chose to remove her parents rather than let the truth stand. Her mother, Bikhar Pan, who had come to Canada with nothing and worked to give her daughter everything, was shot to death in the basement of her own home. Her father, Hue Han Pan, survived a bullet to the head and lived on with the wound, the insomnia, the inability to work, and the knowledge that the plan to kill him had been arranged by his own child. He has said that he lost his wife and his daughter on the same night, and that he survived in body while something in him died with Bikhar. The house on Helen Avenue, bought as the safe endpoint of 2 refugees' long climb, became the place where one of them was murdered and the other was left for dead. Jennifer Pan was 24 on the night her mother was killed. She is 40 now, still in prison, but for the first time since 2010, there is a version of her future that includes walking out. Her mother has no such version. Her father, The man whose survival turned a perfect crime into a confession carries the rest of his life as the only living witness to what his daughter arranged in the house he had bought to keep his family safe. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case leaves North America for Sao Paulo, Brazil, and a wealthy family mansion where an 18-year-old let her boyfriend and his brother inside to kill the parents who had forbidden the relationship. Suzanne von Richthofen helped stage the scene as a burglary and then waited to inherit, until the clumsiness of the cover-up turned the family fortune into the evidence that buried her. Case 4. Suzanne von Richthofen. It was late on the night of the 30th of October 2002, turning into the early hours of the 31st, in a comfortable home in one of the wealthier districts of Sao Paulo, Brazil. The family that lived there had everything the city measured success by. Manfred Albert von Richthofen was a 49-year-old engineer who held a senior role in a state highway development company, a German-Brazilian who claimed descent from a famous First World War pilot. His wife, Maricia, was a psychiatrist. They had 2 children, an 18-year-old daughter named Suzanne, a law student, and a 15-year-old son named Andreas. That night, while Manfred and Maricia slept, their daughter unlocked the house and let in 2 young men carrying iron bars. By the time the sun came up, both parents would be beaten to death in their own bed, and Suzanne would be arranging the scene to look like the work of strangers. The fracture in the family had a name: Daniel Clavinhos de Paula y Silva. Suzanne had met Daniel in 1999, and the two had begun a relationship that deepened over the following years. Daniel came from a lower middle-class family, a world away from the von Richthofens in the rigid social geography of Sao Paulo, and that gap was the heart of the problem. Manfred and Maricia did not approve, and they moved to keep the two apart. The disapproval hardened into opposition, and in their daughter's mind, the parents who kept trying to end the relationship became an obstacle to be removed. 2 motives ran together. The first was the relationship itself. The second was the family fortune, estimated by various sources at sums ranging from around 2 million reais to far larger figures, which stood to pass to Suzanne and her brother once their parents were gone. The plan, in the end, was a way to inherit early. On the chosen night, the pieces were set in place with care. Suzanne made sure her 15-year-old brother Andreas was out of the house. She stayed awake while her parents went to bed, checked that they were asleep, and disconnected the home alarm system, the single safeguard that might have warned them. Then she let in Daniel and his older brother, Christian Clavinhos, who had brought iron bars taken from a nearby construction site. The 3 had reportedly taken a cocktail of drugs that night, described in later accounts as a mix of marijuana, paint thinner, and glue. The 2 brothers went upstairs to the bedroom where Manfred and Maricia lay sleeping and beat both parents about the head with the iron bars, striking more than 30 blows in all by the later reckoning of the court, and using towels in the course of the attack. The heavier physical role was placed on Christian, the older brother, though the planning was traced to Daniel and Suzanne. Manfred and Maricia never woke into any real chance to defend themselves. They were killed in the bed they slept in, by 2 young men let inside by their own daughter, who was somewhere in the house while it happened. What the 3 did next is the reason the case belongs in any account of killers who nearly walked away. Rather than flee and leave an obvious double murder behind, they staged the house to look like a robbery gone wrong, scattering belongings and disturbing rooms to sell the story of intruders who had broken in and killed the couple. Suzanne then stepped into the role of the grief-stricken daughter who had come home to the unthinkable discovery, while Daniel reported the supposed break-in. In the first hours, that was the story on the table. A wealthy couple killed in a home invasion, survived by a daughter and a son. The story did not survive contact with the evidence for long. The staged robbery was clumsy, and to investigators who had seen real break-ins, the scene looked wrong almost immediately. There was no genuine sign of forced entry, which fit very well with someone inside disarming the alarm and opening the door. Items of obvious value had been left behind or scattered rather than taken. Alongside the physical scene, there was Suzanne herself, whose cool composure in the aftermath struck people as wrong for a daughter who had just lost both parents, and which fed the description that would follow her, the personification of an evil blonde. The thread that pulled the whole thing apart led through the poorer of the two brothers. Not long after the murders, Christian Crevinios came into money he had no obvious way of having, and spent some of it on a motorcycle bought with cash. An anonymous tip drew police attention to that purchase, and to the question of where a young man of limited means had suddenly found the money. When investigators questioned Christian, he confessed. And in confessing, he implicated his brother Daniel and Suzanne in the plot. The disabled alarm, the unforced entry, the scattered valuables, and Suzanne's strange calm now had a frame that made sense of all of them. The grieving daughter had let the killers in. The arrests turned a private family horror into a national obsession. Brazil followed the case with an intensity driven by its central contrast: the wealthy, privileged law student and the poorer young man she had taken up with against her parents' wishes. As the process ground forward, the defendants turned on one another. Suzanne placed the primary blame on Daniel, casting herself as a manipulated girl led astray with drugs, while the Crevinios brothers insisted they had acted on her wishes. The defense also raised a claim that Suzanne had been abused by her father, an allegation her own brother Andreas and others connected to the family rejected. Suzanne was released to house arrest in 2005 to await trial. The trial opened in Sao Paulo in July of 2006, and the prosecutor, Roberto Tardelli, rejected her portrait of herself as a manipulated girl and named her the mastermind of the killings. On the 22nd of July 2006, the verdict came down. Suzanne von Richthofen and Daniel Crevinios were each sentenced to 39 years and 6 months in prison. Christian Crevinios, judged to have played a somewhat lesser role in the planning, received a sentence of around 38 years. A young woman who had been 18 on the night of the murders was now bound for decades behind bars for arranging the deaths of the two people who had raised her. The person left to carry the loss with no part in the crime was Andreas, the younger brother sent away from the house that night. At 15, he lost both of his parents at once, and then watched his older sister revealed as the one who had let their killers in. He rejected the claims raised in her defense and spoke for the parents who could no longer speak for themselves. What stays in the public record is a sentence that did not run its full length. Suzanne served around 16 years and was released on parole in 2023, resettling, marrying, and reappearing as a recognizable figure in a country that had never forgotten her name. Her parents have none of that. Manfred and Maricia von Richthofen have been dead since the early hours of a night in October 2002, beaten to death in their sleep in the home they had worked their whole lives to build, by two young men their daughter let through the door. The daughter, who staged a robbery to hide what she had done, was found out by a motorcycle bought with cash, served her time, and walked back into the world, while the comfortable home in Sao Paulo became the place where the family ended. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case rewinds to 1975 and a quiet town in Northern California, where a 16-year-old talked the boy who adored her into killing the parents who had adopted her. Marlene Olive and her boyfriend then drove the bodies to a state park and burned them in a fire pit, a blaze that a passing fireman at first mistook for the remains of a deer. Case 5. Marlene Olive. It was the afternoon of the 21st of June 1975 in Terra Linda, a quiet suburban neighborhood in San Rafael in Marin County, California. In a house on Hibiscus Way lived Jim Olive, a business consultant, and his wife Naomi, along with their 16-year-old daughter Marlene, whom they had adopted at birth. That afternoon, Marlene arranged to go out shopping with her father, while her mother stayed home, and while the two of them were gone, Marlene's 19-year-old boyfriend let himself into the house. By the time the bodies were found, both parents would be dead, their remains burned almost beyond recognition in a pit at a nearby state park. The Olive home was troubled long before the killings. Marlene had been born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1959 and given up for adoption, and she learnt the truth as a girl, a wound that never fully closed. The family had lived abroad before moving to Marin in the early 1970s, dropping a teenager into the drug-soaked, occult-curious youth culture of the era. Naomi, meanwhile, drank heavily and struggled with mental illness, and the relationship between mother and daughter curdled into open warfare inside a house that had stopped functioning the way it once had. By 1974, Marlene had found the person who would help her turn that conflict into something lethal. Charles Riley, known as Chuck, was an overweight, shy young man a few years older than Marlene, a small-time drug dealer who fell completely under her influence. The relationship was one-sided throughout. She offered him attention, and in return he gave her devotion and a willingness to do whatever she asked. People who later studied the case compared the dynamic to the way a manipulative figure can bend a lonely follower to their will. The pressure built through the first half of 1975. That spring, Marlene and Chuck went on a shoplifting spree that ran into thousands of dollars, and when Naomi found out, she threatened to send Marlene to juvenile hall. Marlene had spoken before of wanting her mother dead, and with Chuck beside her, the talk hardened into a plan. As long as her parents were in control, the freedom she wanted was out of reach, and she came to see the two people who had raised her as the obstacle to be removed. On the chosen afternoon, Marlene drew her father away from the house while Chuck attacked Naomi, who was napping. He struck her with a claw hammer, and when that failed to kill her, he stabbed her with a kitchen knife. The attack was still unfinished when Jim and Marlene returned, and when Jim tried to intervene, Chuck shot him. The hands that killed Naomi and Jim were Chuck Riley's. The plan that put him inside the house was Marlene's. What the two did next gave the case its grim nickname. They wrapped the bodies, drove to China Camp State Park, and burned the remains in an old pit, dousing them with gasoline to make them unrecognizable. The fire worked so well that firefighters who came upon the scene first took the remains for a deer roasted by hunters, a mistake that let the pair return to destroy more of what was left. The disappearance held only briefly. Jim Olive's business associates raised the alarm when he missed meetings for about a week, and when police found the house empty, the case might have stalled. Instead, Marlene came to a police station and could not stop contradicting herself, telling officers her parents had gone to Lake Tahoe, then that her father had killed her mother, then that her mother was the killer, then that a group of Hell's Angels had taken them. In the end, she led detectives to the fire pit, and the investigation closed in on Chuck Riley. The outcomes split sharply. Chuck Riley was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life when California's death penalty was struck down in the mid-1970s. He spent around 4 decades in prison before his eventual release. Marlene, 16 at the time, was tried as a juvenile and served only about 4 years before walking free as a young woman. What stays in the record is the gap between the act and the cost. 2 people who had taken in an abandoned infant were beaten, stabbed, shot, and burned in a park pit, and the daughter who planned it served 4 years, while the young man she had bent to her purpose served roughly 40. Jim and Naomi Olive, whatever the troubles in their home, died for the act of adopting a child, and the case endures as a study in how a 16-year-old could arrange the destruction of the only parents she had ever known and be returned to ordinary life a few short years later. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to a small city in Alberta, Canada, in 2006, where a 12-year-old and her much older boyfriend turned on her entire family in a single night. Jasmine Richardson became the youngest person in modern Canadian history convicted of multiple first-degree murders, and the 3 people she helped kill included her 8-year-old brother. Case 6. Jasmine Richardson. It was the night of the 23rd of April 2006 in Medicine Hat, a quiet city of around 60,000 people in the southern corner of Alberta, Canada. the kind of place where violent crime was rare enough to feel almost theoretical. In a split-level house in an ordinary neighbourhood lived the Richardson family. Mark Richardson was 42, his wife Deborah was 48, and they had 2 children, a 12-year-old daughter named Jasmine and an 8-year-old son named Tyler. By the standards of the street they lived on, they were unremarkable, a working couple raising 2 kids in a house like the others around it. By the time that night was over, 3 of the 4 people in that home would be dead, stabbed to death in their own basement and bedroom, and the 4th, the 12-year-old daughter, would be on the run across the province with the grown man who had helped her kill her family. When the killings came to light, they horrified the small community and the entire country alike. A triple homicide inside a family home in a city that almost never saw anything like it. The Richardsons were, by the accounts of those who knew them, a family that had pulled itself into stability. Mark and Deborah had a history they had worked to leave behind, and by the time they were raising Jasmine and Tyler, they had built a normal, settled household. They were the parents at the centre of an ordinary Canadian childhood, the kind that involved school, a younger brother, a family home, and the everyday friction between a preteen daughter and the people setting her boundaries. Mark and Deborah had reportedly struggled earlier in their lives and had worked hard to build the steady home their children were growing up in, which made the destruction of that home all the more bitter. Tyler was still the youngest member of the family and the one with the least say in anything that was happening around him. Nothing about the family from the outside suggested what was forming inside it, because the thing that would destroy the Richardsons had come into their daughter's life from somewhere they could only partly see. The fracture had a name, and the name was Jeremy Steinke. Early in 2006, Jasmine met Steinke at a punk rock show. What followed was a deeply inappropriate connection between the two, and the adults around Jasmine recognized it as a serious concern. Steinke was a high school dropout with a difficult past of his own, a young man who had moved around a great deal, had endured a hard childhood, and had found an identity in goth culture. His childhood had been unstable, marked by frequent moves and, by later accounts, exposure to abusive stepfathers, and he had struggled at school, where he was bullied and mocked over his name. There was speculation, never confirmed, that he had been affected by fetal alcohol syndrome, and he was described as dealing with attention difficulties. He was, in short, a damaged adult who had found in a 12-year-old girl an admirer who took his fantasies seriously. He cultivated a persona that should have been a warning in itself, telling people he was a 300-year-old werewolf with the power to eat people and wearing a vial of blood around his neck. To a vulnerable 12-year-old, that theatrical darkness was a draw rather than a danger sign. The two of them had met in person at a show, then kept the relationship alive online through forums and emails in the early days of the kind of internet connection that let a child and an adult talk privately and constantly with little adult oversight. It was a period when the social internet was still new and its dangers were poorly understood, when a child could form a constant private connection with an adult stranger, and the adults responsible for her might never see the half of it. Before Steinke came into her life, Jasmine had been described as a happy and social child, and the change in her, those around her noticed, came after she became involved with the older man. Mark and Deborah Richardson did what responsible parents do when an adult man attaches himself to their 12-year-old child. They disapproved, and they tried to put a stop to it. They saw the age gap, they saw the man behind it, and they moved to keep the two apart. For most families, that intervention is the end of the story. An unsuitable older boyfriend pushed out of a young teenager's life by parents doing their job. In this case, the parents' entirely reasonable effort to protect their daughter became, in the daughter's mind, the grievance that justified everything that followed. Jasmine did not accept the separation. She and Steinke continued to communicate, and their messages turned from a forbidden romance into something far darker. Conversations about getting rid of the people standing between them. Investigators and the courts treated the relationship as what it was, an adult man's predatory involvement with a child, and the revenge motive that drove the killings grew directly out of her parents' attempt to end it. The planning unfolded largely in writing, which is part of why so much of it could later be reconstructed. In their exchanges, Jasmine and Steinke discussed killing her family. By one account, Jasmine wrote to Steinke that she had a plan, language that would later sit at the heart of the case against her. At her trial, she would describe these conversations as hypothetical, talk about killing her family that she insisted she never actually intended to carry out. The written record told a different story, one of a 12-year-old and a 23-year-old moving step by step from resentment toward the parents who had separated them into an agreement to murder them. Whatever Jasmine told herself about how serious it was, the plan did not stay on the screen. It came into the house on the night of the 23rd of April. That night, Jeremy Steinke went to the Richardson home. He entered the house and made his way to the basement, wearing a neoprene mask over his face and carrying a knife. Deborah Richardson was the first person he encountered, and he attacked her there in the basement, stabbing her many times, by later accounts around a dozen wounds. Mark Richardson heard the struggle and came to help his wife. He tried to fight back, reportedly grabbing a screwdriver to defend himself and his family, and Steinke turned the knife on him as well, stabbing him far more times than he had stabbed Deborah, by accounts more than 20. The violence in that basement was frenzied and close, inflicted with a knife on two parents who had been going about an ordinary evening in their own home. When Mark, in his final moments, asked the man attacking him why this was happening, Steinke reportedly answered that it was what his daughter wanted. Both parents were killed in their own home, by an intruder their daughter had let into her life and into their lives. What happened next is the detail that has made the case almost impossible to take in, and it is also the point on which the two perpetrators told different stories. 8-year-old Tyler Richardson was upstairs in his bedroom while his parents were being killed below. He did not survive the night. Tyler was stabbed and his throat was cut. Jasmine and Steinke gave conflicting accounts of how that happened. Jasmine claimed that Steinke ordered her to kill her little brother. Steinke, for his part, testified that he stood in the doorway and watched as Jasmine stabbed Tyler and slashed his throat, and he told investigators that Jasmine was the one who killed the boy. The accounts agree on the central, unbearable fact that the 8-year-old was killed in his own bedroom that night, and that his 12-year-old sister was the person in the room with him. A child who had done nothing, who had no part in any romance or any quarrel, died because he was in the house. With 3 members of the family dead, Jasmine and Steinke fled. For a brief period, the situation might have looked, to anyone who did not yet know the truth, like a horror that had also swept up the family's daughter. 3 Richardsons had been found murdered, and the 12-year-old was missing, which left open the possibility that she too was a victim, taken, or worse. That possibility did not last. The same written communications that had carried the planning now pointed straight at the planners. A trail of digital evidence, the emails and messages between Jasmine and Steinke, led investigators to the pair. They were tracked down and arrested the day after the killings, found together in Saskatchewan in Steinke's vehicle. Steinke would later incriminate himself further in an undercover operation, confessing the killings to a police officer he believed to be a fellow criminal, a confession that helped seal the case against him. Witnesses would later describe the two of them admitting to what they had done, with one recalling Steinke describing the victims in butcher's terms. The missing daughter was no victim of the crime. She was one of its 2 authors. A third person was drawn into the case as well. A friend of Steinke's, who had knowledge of the plan and helped the pair, was later convicted of obstruction for the part she played around the killings and the flight that followed, and she received a sentence of house arrest. The core of the case, though, came down to the 12-year-old and the 23-year-old, and to the question of how the Canadian justice system should handle a defendant so young, accused of a crime so grave. Jasmine was tried in 2007. Because of her age, Canadian law shielded her identity, and throughout the proceedings she was publicly identifiable only by her initials, a child accused of murder whose name could not be printed in her own country, even as the facts of the case filled the news. She pleaded not guilty. Her defense leaned on the idea that her talk of killing her family had been hypothetical, dark conversation that she had never meant to act upon. The jury did not accept it. She was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder for her mother, her father, and her little brother. Having turned 13 by the time of her conviction, she became the youngest person in Canada ever convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder, a record that placed the case in a category by itself. The evidence the jury weighed included the pair's own written words to each other, the plan laid out in messages, set against Jasmine's insistence that none of it had been meant in earnest. The sentence reflected the hard limits of what the youth justice system could impose. The maximum available for a young offender was 10 years, and that is what she received, structured as an intensive rehabilitative custody and supervision sentence, a term that combined a period of secure psychiatric custody with a longer stretch of conditional supervision in the community. In practice, that meant roughly 4 years held in a secure psychiatric setting, followed by years of supervised reintegration, a structure built around the idea that a child of her age could still be rehabilitated. For 3 murders, including the killing of an 8-year-old child, the ceiling the law allowed for a 12-year-old was a decade, much of it not spent in a conventional prison at all. Jeremy Steinke, the adult, faced the full weight of the system. He was convicted in 2008 of 3 counts of first-degree murder, after reportedly confessing to an undercover officer, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with 3 concurrent life terms and no eligibility for parole for 25 years. The 11-year age gap that had alarmed Jasmine's parents now marked the difference between a 10-year youth sentence and a life term. What stays in the public record about Jasmine Richardson is the way her sentence ran its course and then simply ended. She completed her 10-year term in the spring of 2016. At a final review in Medicine Hat, the same judge who had overseen her case from the beginning addressed her in strikingly hopeful terms, telling her that her parents and brother would be proud of the person she had become, and that, while she could never undo the past, she could control how she lived each day going forward. It was an extraordinary thing for a judge to say to a person convicted of helping kill her whole family, and it reflected the system's wager that the girl who committed the crime and the young woman leaving custody were 2 different people. With that, on the 6th of May 2016, she was released from all further conditions, restrictions, and supervision. By then, she was a young woman in her early 20s. She was reported to be working, living on her own, and rebuilding an ordinary life, and she has lived since under a new identity, her name and face kept out of public view by the same youth protections that had shielded her at trial. The reaction in Medicine Hat captured the impossible nature of the case. Some neighbours believed that a child of 12 deserved a genuine second chance, that the person she might become should not be defined forever by what she did as a 7th grader under the influence of a much older man. Others held to a simpler principle, that a person old enough to take part in 3 murders should serve a sentence that matched the harm, and that 10 years, much of it outside a prison, did not. The case became a fixture in Canadian debate about the Youth Criminal Justice Act, held up by some as proof the law was too soft for the rare child who commits the gravest crimes, and by others as a hard case that should never be allowed to reshape a system built for children. Medicine Hat had to absorb the knowledge that one of its own children had taken part in wiping out her family, a fact the city has never entirely been able to file away. Both reactions were responses to the same unsettling truth at the centre of the case. Mark and Deborah Richardson tried to protect their daughter from an adult who had no business in her life, and they were murdered for it. Tyler Richardson was 8 years old and had done nothing at all, and he was killed in his bed. The girl who took part in destroying her entire family served the maximum a child could be given, walked free before she was 25, and was sent out into a new life with a new name, while the 3 people she helped kill stayed exactly where that April night had left them. Tyler Richardson would have grown up in the years since, finished school, become an adult, built a life of his own, Instead, he remains forever the 8-year-old killed in his bedroom on a spring night in 2006. The case remains the starkest example in Canadian history of how young a multiple murderer can be, and of how little the law could do once the worst had already happened inside one ordinary house. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to Virginia in 2017, where a daughter is accused of shooting her own mother and then her sister inside the family home, and of arranging the scene so that the two deaths would read as a murder followed by a suicide. At the heart of it sat a bitter quarrel over the mother's house and the money tied up in it. Case 7. Megan Hagen. It was the 14th of July 2017, a Friday, in McLean, Virginia, an affluent suburb of Washington in Fairfax County, where large, comfortable homes sit behind quiet, well-kept streets. Inside one of those homes lived Pamela Hagen, a 63-year-old business executive who had built a successful career along with members of her family. Among them were two of her daughters. One was Helen Hagen, in her early 20s, the youngest of the children. The other was Megan Hagen, an older daughter who was living in the house at the time, together with her own young child. By the end of that day, Pamela and Helen would both be dead, shot inside the home, and the scene around them would be carefully arranged to tell a lie, that Helen had killed her mother and then turned the gun on herself. For more than a year, that lie would stand as the official account of how two members of the Hagen family died. Pamela Hagen was, by the measures the world tends to use, a success. She had risen into the ranks of business leadership, held an executive position, and provided a comfortable life for her family in one of the wealthier corners of Northern Virginia. The home in McLean was the kind of place that signaled a life gone right. At the time of the killings, the household held several members of the family under one roof. Megan had come from West Virginia and was staying in her mother's home together with her daughter, who was 8 years old and present in the house on the day everything came apart. Helen, the youngest, was living there as well. There was at least one more sister in the family, Ashley, who would later give investigators an account of the tensions inside the household. Helen, in her early 20s, was a young woman with her whole life still ahead of her, and she would end up cast in death as the villain of her own family's tragedy. From the outside, the Hagens were an established, prosperous family, the sort whose name would never be expected to surface in a double murder case. The address itself, on a quiet street in McLean, would later become shorthand for the case in the regional press. The pressure that would destroy them was financial, and it was building quietly underneath the surface of that comfortable life. The fracture in the Hagen family ran along the line of money, and specifically a sum of around $400,000. Megan Hagen was in the process of buying a house, a purchase that depended on a large amount of money she did not have on hand. The house she was trying to buy was closing right around the time of the killings, which is part of why the money mattered so urgently to her in those exact days. On the 13th of July 2017, the day before the killings, Megan attempted to move roughly $400,000 out of her mother's bank account, money she needed for the home purchase. That transfer did not go through as she needed it to. Investigators came to believe that Megan killed her mother over that refusal, and over a sense that her mother was prepared to help her younger sister financially while denying Megan what she wanted. By the account that emerged at trial, Pamela had been willing to buy a home for Helen while declining to release the roughly $400,000 Megan wanted for a home of her own, and that perceived favoritism fed Megan's resentment. Prosecutors went further still, tying the killings to a financial scheme around the house purchase and presenting the deaths as the violent end of an effort to get hold of money that was never hers to take. Money was the engine of the whole thing, an amount that to most people would be a fortune, and that, to Megan, proved to be worth her mother's life and her sister's. Detectives would lay out a timeline in which the failed transfer on the 13th was followed the very next day by the deaths of the two people closest to that money. What happened inside the house on the 14th of July was a double killing dressed up as something else. Pamela Hagen was shot, and her body and the shell casings were found in the home's laundry room. Helen Hagen was shot as well, and her body was placed in a bathroom with a small caliber rifle, a .22, positioned between her legs, barrel pointing upward, arranged to suggest that she had used the gun on herself. The weapon was a long gun, a rifle, the kind of detail that would become central to the questions investigators later asked about whether the scene could be real. The story the arrangement was built to tell was that Helen had killed her mother and then killed herself, a murder followed by a suicide, all contained within the family and explained away without any outside killer. Helen, the youngest daughter, dead and unable to speak for herself, was cast as the murderer of her own mother. The person who arranged that scene, prosecutors would argue, was the older sister who stood to benefit and who was in the house, Megan Hagen. For a remarkably long time, the staging worked. When Fairfax County Police arrived and examined the scene, the initial characterization of the deaths was a murder-suicide, the very conclusion the arrangement had been designed to produce. 2 women were dead, a rifle lay positioned as if Helen had turned it on herself, and the simplest reading of the room was the one the staging had handed investigators. That initial reading meant that, in the immediate aftermath, no one was treated as a surviving killer. The case looked closed in the saddest possible way. A young woman who had murdered her mother and ended her own life. For Fairfax County, a place where such crimes were rare, the first impression of a murder-suicide was a grim and self-contained tragedy, the kind that asks no further questions of the neighbours. In that window, the person actually responsible was able to grieve in public as a daughter and sister who had lost half her family, while the official record laid the blame on one of the dead. It is the clearest example in this account of a daughter very nearly escaping, because for over a year, the accepted version of events placed the guilt on a victim and left the real perpetrator free. The arrangement began to fall apart because the physical evidence refused to match the story. Investigators suspected early on that the scene might have been staged, and as they examined the details, the inconsistencies mounted. The fatal gunshot wounds that killed Helen was to the top of her head, which did not fit the way the rifle had been positioned for a self-inflicted death. A person staging a suicide reaches for the obvious image of one, the gun beneath the chin or against the temple, and the mismatch between that expected image and the actual wound at the crown of Helen's head was one of the first threads investigators could pull. The weapon itself raised questions of basic physics. A short handgun can be turned on oneself with ease, while a rifle is long and unwieldy, and the question of whether a young woman could have held and fired such a gun to produce the exact wound she had became one of the central forensic disputes of the case. The location of Pamela's body and the shell casings in the laundry room had to be squared with the larger narrative, and hanging over all of it was the attempted transfer of around $400,000 from Pamela's account the day before she died, a financial motive that pointed directly at the daughter who needed the money. Each inconsistency on its own might have been explained away. Taken together, they described a scene that had been composed rather than discovered, a story arranged for the people who would walk in and find it. The more the investigators looked, the more the room read as a stage set, every element placed to deliver a verdict to whoever found it first. In November of 2018, more than a year after the deaths, Fairfax County Police made an arrest that changed the case completely. The gap between the deaths and the arrest was itself a measure of how convincing the staging had been. They charged Megan Hagen, who had been living in West Virginia, in the killings of both her mother and her sister. The investigation that had started as a tragic murder-suicide was now a double murder prosecution against a member of the family. Megan maintained her innocence. She pleaded not guilty and held to that plea through both trials. Her position throughout was that the original reading had been correct, that Helen had shot their mother and then herself, and she pointed to reasons her sister might have been in crisis. The defense raised the idea that Helen had been upset over a house her mother had decided against buying for her, and over her mother's disapproval of Helen's boyfriend. Information surfaced that Pamela had suspected Helen of drug use and had considered holding an intervention, and that Helen had reportedly attempted suicide at an earlier point in her life. These were the threads the defense would pull on through years of litigation, the argument being that a troubled young woman in conflict with her mother had done exactly what the staged scene suggested. The prosecution's task was to show that the scene had been built rather than stumbled upon, and that the hand behind it belonged to the surviving sister. The first trial took place in March of 2022, almost 5 years after the killings. After a trial lasting about 3 weeks, a jury deliberated for less than 2 days before finding Megan Hagen guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for her mother and her sister, along with 2 counts of using a firearm in the commission of a felony. The jury recommended a sentence of life in prison on each of the murder counts. For a moment, the case appeared resolved, with the daughter who had staged her family's deaths convicted of causing them. That resolution did not hold. In November of 2022, the judge overseeing the case, Brett Kasabian, overturned the double murder conviction on the grounds of juror misconduct. One of the jurors had conducted her own experiment at home, using a rifle to try to determine whether it was physically possible for Helen Hagen to have shot herself, and had then told her fellow jurors during deliberations that the defense's theory could not work. Jurors are required to decide a case only on the evidence presented in the courtroom, and the private reenactment crossed that line. The conviction was vacated, and Megan Hagen, who had been found guilty of killing her mother and sister, faced the prospect of the whole ordeal beginning again. The prosecution chose to retry the case rather than let it collapse. The Fairfax County Commonwealth's attorney, Steve Descano, committed publicly to pursuing the case again, framing it as a continued fight for justice for a family that had already endured years of heartbreak. The retrial was held in September of 2023. This time, on the 22nd of September, a second jury reached the same conclusion the first had, finding Megan Hagen guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and the related firearms charges. The second jury had begun its deliberations one afternoon and returned its verdict the following day, arriving at guilt about as quickly as the first had. 2 separate juries in 2 separate trials had now heard the evidence and concluded that Megan had shot her mother and her sister and staged the aftermath. The alternative story she had maintained from the beginning, that her dead sister was responsible, had been rejected twice over. The case had drawn sustained attention across the Washington region, both for the calculated nature of the staging and for the rare spectacle of a murder conviction being thrown out and then won all over again. The sentencing came on the 26th of January 2024, almost 7 years after the July afternoon when Pamela and Helen were shot. Megan Hagen was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders of her mother and her sister, with an additional term of 6 years for the firearm charges. The consecutive nature of the life terms meant that the law had treated each killing as its own complete crime. The mother and the daughter each counted, neither folded into the other. The prosecutor spoke of the magnitude of what had been done, describing how, on a quiet Friday morning in her mother's home, Megan had made an irreversible decision that devastated her family and shook the wider community. He acknowledged, as prosecutors in such cases often must, that no verdict could bring back the people who had been lost, and that real justice would have meant Pamela and Helen still being alive, with the conviction offering accountability rather than anything like repair. Through it all, Megan Hagen never admitted to the killings, holding to the account that her sister had been responsible, long after 2 juries had found otherwise. For the family, the 2 convictions and the consecutive life terms were the closest the system could come to answering what had been done. The formal recognition that Pamela and Helen had been murdered, and that the murder-suicide story had been a fabrication from the start. What stays in the public record about Megan Hagen is the cold completeness of the deception and how close it came to working. 2 women were killed in their own home, and the scene was arranged so that the younger of them, Helen, would be remembered as the killer of her own mother, rather than as a victim. For more than a year, that is exactly how the deaths were classified. a murder-suicide that closed the book on the Hagen family with a lie that defamed the dead alongside killing them. It took the patient work of investigators, the stubborn refusal of the forensic evidence to fit the staged story, and ultimately 2 full trials to undo what had been built in a single afternoon. Pamela Hagen, the executive who had provided the comfortable life at the centre of it all, was killed over money she would not release. Helen Hagen, in her early 20s, was killed and then blamed for everything. Megan Hagen's own young daughter, 8 years old, was in the house when the shootings happened, a child present in the home where her grandmother and her aunt were destroyed. The surviving members of the family were left to carry the loss of 2 people and, on top of it, the knowledge of who had taken them and how nearly the truth had been buried. What makes the case linger is the patience the deception required, the willingness to shoot 2 family members and then bend to the work of making it look like one of them was to blame. The home in McLean that had stood for a successful life became the address of one of Northern Virginia's most disturbing family murders, a place where a daughter killed her mother for a wire transfer and tried to make the world believe her sister had done it. The 8-year-old who had been in the house would grow up knowing that her mother was a convicted double murderer and that 2 members of her family had died in those rooms. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to rural Wisconsin in 2015, where a 17-year-old shot her stepfather and stabbed her mother to death inside the family home, then shut her younger half-sisters away from the scene before fleeing across state lines with her boyfriend. Behind the killings lay years of what would come to be described as a profoundly abusive household. Case 8. Ashley Martinson. It was the weekend of the 7th and 8th of March 2015 in the town of Peel, a small rural community in northern Wisconsin near Rhinelander. In a house there lived the Ayers family, 37-year-old Thomas Ayers, known as Tony, his 40-year-old wife Jennifer, her 17-year-old daughter Ashley Martinson, and 3 younger girls who ranged in age from a toddler to about 9. The killings happened on or around the 7th of March, the day after Ashley turned 17, and the bodies were found the next day. By the time it was over, Thomas and Jennifer were dead, the 3 younger children were shut in a room behind a tied door, and Ashley was fleeing across state lines with her boyfriend. What set this case apart was that the home she destroyed was one the courts would come to treat as profoundly abusive. The Ayers household was, by the accounts that emerged in court, and were corroborated in part by the younger children, a frightening place. Thomas Ayers was described as a man who verbally and physically abused those around him, his wife and his own daughters included, with beatings, threats made with firearms, and a home ruled by fear. Ashley carried her own history as well, including serious abuse she described from a former boyfriend of her mother years earlier. Accounts of exactly who abused whom varied, but the record consistently shows a young woman who had grown up around violence and control, with no stable adult to turn to. The immediate trigger grew out of a relationship. Ashley had a boyfriend who was 22, and her mother and stepfather objected to it, with reason given her age. In the days before the killings, the adults took away her keys and her cell phone and warned the boyfriend to stay away from her because she was a minor. According to the court record, the Ayers were killed the same day they delivered that warning. The walls were closing in on a teenager who already felt trapped, and the record indicates that at one point, overwhelmed, she took up a gun with the intention of turning it on herself. What happened instead was the deaths of both adults. Thomas Ayers was shot, struck in the neck and head. Jennifer Ayers, Ashley's own mother, was stabbed more than 30 times. The weapons, a shotgun and a knife, were found in the home afterward. The oldest of the younger children, a girl of about 9, later told investigators that she had heard gunshots and seen Ashley struggling with their mother. The violence happened in the house while the little ones were present. What Ashley did next reflected the divided nature of the case. Having killed the 2 adults, she did not harm the 3 younger children. She placed them together in a room, gave them some food, and tied the door shut. And then she fled, traveling with her boyfriend toward Indiana. That single act of confining and provisioning the children rather than harming them is part of why the case has never read as the work of someone indifferent to all life. The flight did not last. One of the confined girls reached help, and the oldest named Ashley as the killer. The bodies were found that Sunday, and the authorities put out a multi-state alert. The next day, Ashley and her boyfriend were arrested in Boone County, Indiana. The speed of the capture owed everything to the children she had confined, whose survival and testimony pointed investigators straight at her. The legal process had to weigh the gravity of a double killing against the documented abuse behind it. Ashley was first charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and 3 counts of false imprisonment. In the end, she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree intentional homicide, a reduced level of charge through which the abuse history found its way into the outcome. In June 2016, she was sentenced to 23 years of confinement, followed by 17 years of extended supervision. The judge acknowledged the abuse she had endured and then drew the line the law required, reasoning that she still had a moment of choice before she killed. Appeals and requests to shorten her sentence were denied. What stays in the record is a case that refuses clean shapes. 2 people died in their home, and the abuse the record documents sits on the other side of the ledger, with Jennifer herself having been a victim of the household's violence before she became a victim of her daughter. 3 young children lost both of the adults raising them, and then sat behind a tied door while their sister drove toward another state. Ashley Martinson, shaped by years of documented fear, made a choice the law treated as a serious crime, regardless of what had been done to her, and she will spend much of her life answering for it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case returns to California, to El Dorado Hills in 2009, where a 14-year-old girl and her older boyfriend killed her mother after she moved to end their relationship. Joanne Witt was stabbed to death in her own home by the daughter she had tried to protect, and the case would come down to the 2 young lovers turning on each other. Case 9. Tyler Witt. It was the night of the 11th of June 2009 in El Dorado Hills, California, a comfortable suburban community east of Sacramento. In a house on a quiet court lived Joanne Witt, a 47-year-old single mother who worked as an engineer for the county. She had 1 child, a 14-year-old daughter named Tyler, who was the center of her life. That night, while Joanne slept in her bed, she was stabbed roughly 20 times in the upper part of her body. By the time her body was found, Joanne would be dead. Her only daughter would be on the run with a 19-year-old boyfriend, and the 2 of them would be carrying a plan to die together rather than face what they had done. The person at the center of the killing was the daughter Joanne had been trying to protect. Joanne Witt had built a stable, ordinary life as a working single mother. She held a steady professional job with El Dorado County, kept a home, and raised her daughter on her own. Tyler was her only child, and by the accounts of the family who spoke after the killings, Joanne had poured herself into that role, making her daughter the whole of her world. A single mother and an only daughter in a suburban house is a small and tightly bound unit, and for years that was what the Witt household was. Joanne was, by every account, a devoted parent, the kind of mother who arranged her life around her child, and there were no signs in the years before 2009 that her home was anything other than a close one, which is part of what made the killing so shocking to the people who knew them. What broke it was something at once ordinary and devastating. A relationship that Joanne, doing exactly what a parent is supposed to do, tried to bring to an end. The fracture had a name, and the name was Stephen Culver, known by the nickname Boston. Culver was 19 years old, 5 years older than Tyler, and the 2 had become involved in a relationship. The gap between a 19-year-old man and a 14-year-old girl went well beyond a teenage romance that adults simply found distasteful. In the eyes of the law, it was statutory rape. An adult in a sexual relationship with a child. When Joanne understood what was happening between her daughter and Culver, she did what a protective mother would do. She objected to the relationship, she moved to separate them, and she reported Culver to the authorities for the statutory rape of her daughter. That report turned Joanne from a disapproving parent into a direct threat to Culver's freedom, because the complaint she had filed could send him to prison. For a parent, reporting a child's boyfriend to the police is a drastic step, the kind taken only when gentler measures have failed, and it is a measure of how seriously Joanne took the danger her daughter was in. Reporting Culver was meant to be the act that ended the threat. Instead, it became the thing that marked Joanne for death, because it gave the two of them both a deadline and a reason to act. What grew between Tyler and Culver in response was the kind of intense, sealed-off teenage attachment that treats the rest of the world as the enemy. The prosecution would later describe Culver as a young man drawn to blood and gore, and would tell jurors that Tyler changed once he came into her life. The defense, for its part, would describe Tyler in even darker terms, as a highly intelligent and skilled manipulator with a history of conflict directed at her mother and others, a portrait meant to support the claim that the hand on the knife had been Tyler's own. Whichever description came closer to the truth, the two of them together had formed a closed world in which the ordinary rules of family and law had stopped applying. The two of them began to mythologize their own situation, casting themselves as lovers kept apart by a cruel world, and they came to see Joanne as the obstacle standing between them and the life they imagined together. The solution they arrived at was to kill her. According to the prosecution, the plan carried the marks of premeditation. Culver was said to have brought a knife from his job at a restaurant, and the killing was carried out against Joanne while she slept, facts that would support special circumstances of lying in wait and of killing a witness, the witness being the very woman who had reported Culver to the police. In California law, those special circumstances are among the factors that can elevate a murder to its most serious form, carrying the heaviest penalties the state allows. Lying in wait described a killing set upon a sleeping victim who had no chance to defend herself. Killing a witness described the motive, the silencing of the person whose complaint threatened to put Culver behind bars. Together, they framed the murder as cold and calculated rather than impulsive. A mother who had tried to shield her child from an adult predator became, in the logic of the two who killed her, a problem to be eliminated. The killing itself, on the night of the 11th of June, was savage. Joanne Witt was stabbed about 20 times, concentrated on the upper half of her body as she lay in her bed. One of the lasting disputes of the case is exactly whose hand held the knife. The two who were there gave opposite accounts, and each pointed at the other. The prosecution's theory was that Culver was the one who stabbed Joanne, driven by his fear of prison, and that Tyler was elsewhere in the house at the moment of the stabbing, though she had helped plan her mother's death. Culver's defense told the jury the reverse, that Tyler had killed her own mother, and that Culver had taken the blame to protect the girl he loved, painting Tyler as a highly intelligent and manipulative person with a history of conflict. What both sides accepted was that Joanne Witt died violently in her own bed, and that her 14-year-old daughter and that daughter's adult boyfriend were the two people responsible for her death. The brutality of the attack, roughly 20 wounds to a woman asleep in her own bed, spoke to a rage and a determination that went far beyond what ending a life would require. Whoever struck the blows, the killing was personal and prolonged. After the killing, the pair made no attempt to construct an elaborate cover story of an intruder. Instead, they fled, leaving Joanne's body behind in the house, and headed toward the San Francisco Bay Area. What they carried with them was a plan to end their own lives together. In journals, the two compared themselves to Romeo and Juliet, framing their situation as a doomed romance crushed by the people who would not let them be together, and they attempted to kill themselves with rat poison. The story they told themselves of two lovers martyred by a cruel world sat grotesquely against the reality of what they had actually done, which was to stab a sleeping mother to death because she had reported a crime committed against her child. They saw themselves as Romeo and Juliet, a comparison that collapses the moment it meets the fact that they had killed a parent in her sleep. The suicide attempt failed, and the two of them remained at large in the Bay Area for several days. The discovery of the murder came through the ordinary rhythms of working life. Joanne missed 2 days of work without calling in, behaviour that was out of character for a reliable county employee, and her supervisor grew concerned enough to contact both law enforcement and Joanne's parents. Sheriff's deputies met the family at Joanne's home, and inside they found her body. The investigation quickly centred on the missing daughter and her boyfriend. Within days, Tyler Witt and Stephen Culver were located and arrested in San Bruno, south of San Francisco, after their car had been found in the city. They had been hiding around a shopping centre in San Bruno, and their capture brought to an end a flight that had lasted only days. The shared death they had written for themselves in the manner of star-crossed lovers never came. The runaway lovers who had imagined a tragic ending were instead taken into custody, alive, to answer for the murder they had left behind. For the colleagues and relatives who had last seen Joanne going about her normal life, the news that she had been killed by her own daughter was almost impossible to absorb. From there, the case turned into a contest between the two of them, and the way it resolved put the starkest possible gap between their fates. Tyler Witt, despite being only 14 at the time of the killing, was charged in her mother's murder, and prosecutors initially pursued a first-degree murder charge against her, with the special circumstances of lying in wait and killing a witness, the kind of charge that carried the heaviest penalties available. Then came the deal that would define the case. In exchange for pleading guilty and testifying against Culver, Tyler was offered the chance to have the special circumstances dropped and her charge reduced from first-degree to second-degree murder, lowering her exposure from 25 years to life down to 15 years to life. She took the deal, and she testified against the young man she had once cast as her partner in a tragic romance. The arrangement was, in its way, a hard piece of prosecutorial arithmetic. The case against Culver was stronger with Tyler's testimony than without it, and securing that testimony meant offering the younger participant a lighter outcome, so that the 14-year-old who had helped plan the killing of her own mother became the state's key witness against the man who carried it out. Her testimony was central enough that the proceedings were repeatedly delayed around it, at one point held up over questions about new DNA evidence. On the witness stand, Tyler told the court that the plea agreement had not been her reason for testifying, saying instead that she had found religion during her incarceration and felt called to tell the truth. Stephen Culver took his case to trial, maintaining his innocence and insisting that Tyler had been the killer. The trial, in the spring of 2011, became a spectacle of two former lovers turning on each other in open court, each describing the other as the true murderer. The jury did not accept Culver's version. The trial ran for about a month, from the middle of May to the middle of June 2011, and the verdict came on the 15th of June. He was convicted of the first-degree murder of Joanne Witt. At the sentencing, held in Placerville before El Dorado County Superior Court Judge Daniel Proud, the contrast in outcomes was made final. Culver, by then 21, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge condemned the brutality of the killing, observing that no person deserved to die in the manner Joanne Witt had. Tyler, 16 by the time of sentencing, was allowed to withdraw her first-degree plea and enter the agreed plea to second-degree murder, and she received 15 years to life. Her attorney asked that she be sent to a youth facility, given her age at the time of the crime, and the judge refused. The two were sentenced on the same day, in a courtroom packed with members of both families, and Culver sat expressionless as his sentence was read and was led away to begin a term that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. The sentencing hearing also gave Joanne's family the chance to speak, and their words captured the wreckage left behind. One relative reminded Tyler that she had never appreciated what her mother had done for her, that she had been her mother's whole world and her only child. Joanne's sister offered a more measured account, telling the court that, removed from the influences that had surrounded her, Tyler had grown into a more mature and responsible young woman than she had been at the time of the killing. Both things became part of the record: the devastation of a family that had lost Joanne to her own daughter, and the possibility that the girl who had taken part in the murder at 14 might grow into a different person in the years that followed. The family members who spoke were divided in their anger and their hope, a division that the case itself never resolved. Joanne's brother told the court he hoped prison would be the worst experience imaginable for Culver. Joanne's father addressed Tyler directly, calling her a murderer who had made terrible choices she would have to pay for, while also voicing a hope that she might one day pursue an education and contribute something to the world. The grief in that room had no single shape. What stays in the public record about Tyler Witt is the distance between where the two killers ended up. Stephen Culver, the adult in the relationship, was sentenced to die in prison, with no parole and no path back to the outside world. Tyler Witt, the daughter who had helped plan her mother's death, and whose hand may or may not have held the knife, used her testimony to secure a far lighter sentence, and in time, she walked out. In August of 2022, she was granted parole, and she was released in 2023, a free woman before she reached her 30s. By then, she had served roughly 13 years for her part in the death of her mother, and she stepped back into a world her mother would never see again. Joanne Witt, the single mother who had tried to protect her 14-year-old from a grown man and was killed for filing the report that might have stopped him, received none of that. She had been her daughter's entire world, by her own family's description, and she died in her bed at the hands of that daughter and that daughter's boyfriend. The home in El Dorado Hills became the place where a mother's attempt to do right by her child ended in her own murder. The case stands as a grim example of how a teenage relationship, wrapped in the borrowed language of doomed love, curdled into the killing of the one person who had been trying to keep a child safe, and of how differently the law can treat two people who took part in the same death. The questions it raised have never fully settled. Whether Tyler was a manipulated child swept up by an older predator, or a calculating instigator who used that predator and then used the courts to save herself, depends on which account one believes. And the people who sat through the trial did not all come away believing the same thing. What remains beyond dispute is that Joanne Witt is dead, that she died trying to keep her daughter safe, and that the daughter she gave everything to helped arrange the night that killed her. That much the record states plainly, and no version of the story can soften it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case is the one many will already know by name, the killing of Dee Dee Blanchard in Springfield, Missouri in 2015. Her daughter, Gypsy Rose, had spent her entire childhood made to appear gravely ill by a mother now widely understood to have fabricated those illnesses, and the daughter's escape from that captivity came through her boyfriend and a knife. Case 10. Gypsy Rose Blanchard. It was June of 2015 in Springfield, Missouri. Outside a small house painted a cheerful shade, the kind of modest home a charity had helped build for a family everyone in the area believed to be among the most unfortunate they knew. Inside lived Claudine Blanchard, known to everyone as Dee Dee, who was 48, and her daughter, Gypsy Rose, who was in her early 20s, though the world had been told she was far younger. For years, the community had rallied around the pair, a devoted mother caring single-handedly for a daughter said to be gravely and chronically ill, confined to a wheelchair, fed through a tube, fighting one terrible diagnosis after another. By the middle of that June, Dee Dee Blanchard would be found dead in her bed, stabbed to death, and the daughter everyone had pitied would be revealed as the person who had arranged her killing. The truth that came out alongside the murder was stranger and darker than the crime itself. The ordinary world of the Blanchard household was a fiction, built and maintained by Dee Dee over almost the whole of her daughter's life. Gypsy Rose had been presented since childhood as a catalogue of serious illnesses. Dee Dee told doctors, charities, neighbours, and Gypsy herself that the girl suffered from leukemia, from muscular dystrophy, from epilepsy, from asthma, from impaired vision and hearing, and from brain damage that had supposedly left her with the mental capacity of a young child. Gypsy was placed in a wheelchair, though she could walk. She was fed through a tube, though she could eat normally. Her head was kept shaved, presented as the result of chemotherapy. She was subjected to medications and to medical procedures and surgeries that she did not need, and over the years the treatments did her real harm, including damage to her teeth. She was put through eye surgery, the removal of salivary glands, and a long series of hospital visits, and was kept on medication that, by the time the truth came out, had cost her many of her teeth. Every procedure deepened the fiction and bound her more tightly to the mother who arranged it. Dee Dee also lied about Gypsy's age, shaving years off it so that a grown young woman could be passed off as a sick child. What looked from the outside like devotion was, the evidence would later show, a sustained campaign of medical abuse carried out over nearly 2 decades. The condition behind this has a clinical name: factitious disorder imposed on another, more widely known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. It describes a caregiver who fabricates or even induces illness in a person under their care, most often a child, in order to draw sympathy, attention, and material support. Dee Dee Blanchard was, by the assessment of experts who later examined the case, a textbook and extreme example. Part of what let it continue so long was a pattern of moving from doctor to doctor, so that no single physician ever assembled the full picture, and the family had relocated more than once, including a move that followed a major hurricane on the Gulf Coast and brought them from Louisiana to Missouri. On at least one occasion, a doctor grew suspicious that the child in the wheelchair was healthier than her mother claimed, but the concern went nowhere, brushed aside by a mother who always had an answer and a daughter who had been coached her whole life to play the part. The fabricated illnesses also paid. The deception brought the family a steady stream of benefits, including the specially built house, trips funded by wish-granting organizations such as a visit to a famous theme park, disability support, and the constant goodwill of a community moved by the sight of a mother carrying such a heavy burden. Gypsy's biological father, who lived apart from them, was kept in the dark like everyone else, told that his daughter was seriously ill and younger than she truly was. Relatives who raised quiet doubts were managed and kept at a distance. The whole structure held because few people think to question a mother who appears to be sacrificing everything for a dying child, and because the one person who could have exposed the lie, Gypsy herself, was the person with the least power in the entire arrangement. By the time it ended, the deception had drawn in physicians, charities, fundraisers, and an entire community, none of whom had reason to imagine that the sick child at the centre of it was being made sick by the very person they admired for caring for her. For the daughter at the centre of the fiction, the cost is hard to overstate. Gypsy Rose grew up a prisoner inside a story written entirely by her mother. She was isolated, controlled, made to perform illness for strangers, kept dependent on the one person orchestrating all of it, and punished when she stepped out of line. As she grew older, she came to understand that she could walk, that she could eat, that the wheelchair and the feeding tube and the diagnoses did not match what her own body could do. An expert who studied the case later described her as, in essence, a hostage, and framed what eventually happened as the act of a captive trying to gain her freedom. That framing does not erase the killing that followed, and it does not pretend the killing was anything other than a killing. but the case cannot be understood without it. The home that the public saw as a place of heroic caregiving was, for the daughter, a place of captivity she could see no ordinary way out of. She had little real schooling, no friends except those her mother allowed, and almost nothing of her own, which left her without the everyday tools a young adult would normally use, simply to leave. Escape, for her, had been engineered into something that felt impossible by ordinary means. The path out, when Gypsy finally found one, ran through the internet and through a young man named Nicholas Godejohn. Around 2012, having managed to get online despite her mother's controls, Gypsy connected with Godejohn through a Christian dating website. He lived hundreds of miles away in Wisconsin, and for roughly 2 years their relationship played out almost entirely online, a mix of fairy tale fantasies about a life together and private role play. At some point, Gypsy told him the truth about her health, that she was no dying child, whatever her mother told the world. The two of them met in person for the first time in early 2015, arranging an outing to a movie theatre in Springfield, where she went in costume. Their online world had a strong element of fantasy and roleplay, and within it the two of them began, over time, to talk about a future that had no place in it for Dee Dee. The fantasy and the plan grew together, until the plan became real. The relationship gave Gypsy something she had never been allowed, a connection of her own outside her mother's control, and it became the channel through which the idea of escape took shape. As long as Dee Dee was alive, Gypsy believed, the captivity would never end. The plan the two of them arrived at was to kill her. In June of 2015, Godejohn came to the Blanchard home. Gypsy let him into the house and, by the account given in court, provided the knife. While Godejohn went to where Dee Dee was sleeping and stabbed her to death, Gypsy waited apart from it, by her own description, hiding in the bathroom with her ears covered so she would not hear what was happening. The woman who had controlled every moment of her daughter's life for more than 20 years was killed in her own bed, in the small house that had been built out of pity for the family. Afterward, the two of them took several $1,000s from the home and fled, travelling to Godejohn's place in Wisconsin, and, for a brief stretch, Gypsy Rose believed she had finally gotten free. They spent the following days at his home, and in that short window, after a lifetime of total control, Gypsy tasted something close to ordinary freedom for the first time. It lasted only until the message posted online did its work. What broke the case open was a message posted online. From Dee Dee's Facebook account came a short, crude, triumphant declaration that she was dead, language so jarring that the friends who saw it were immediately alarmed. They alerted the authorities and asked someone to check on the family. When sheriff's deputies went to the house, they found Dee Dee's body in her bed, stabbed, and at first the discovery deepened the fear rather than resolving it, because the sick, wheelchair-bound daughter was nowhere to be found. For a short time, investigators worried that Gypsy too had been harmed or taken by whoever had killed her mother. Online, the community that had followed the family for years reacted with an outpouring of fear for the vulnerable daughter they believed was missing, a fear built entirely on an illness that had never existed. That fear dissolved as the facts came in. The Facebook post was traced to Wisconsin, to the home where Gypsy and Godejohn were staying, and when she was found, the daughter, who had been presented to the world as gravely disabled, was able to walk without difficulty and was in good health. The local sheriff captured the moment for the public when he observed that things are not always as they appear. The most pitied girl in Springfield had never been sick at all. The arrest of the two of them turned a murder case into a national story, because the killing could not be separated from the decades of abuse that preceded it. As investigators and the public learned what Dee Dee had done, the simple shape of a daughter who murdered her devoted mother fell apart and was replaced by something far more troubling, a young woman who had been subjected to extreme medical abuse for her entire life and who had arranged the death of her abuser to escape it. Gypsy's medical records became central to the case because they documented the long history of unnecessary treatment and fabricated illness, and that documentation gave her lawyers the ability to argue the abuse in mitigation. The result was a plea agreement. In 2016, Gypsy Rose Blanchard pleaded guilty to second-degree murder for her role in arranging her mother's death, and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a notably lighter outcome that reflected what the record showed about the life she had lived. The plea spared her a trial, and the far longer sentence a first-degree conviction would have carried. Mental health and abuse experts testified and wrote about the case, and the term Munchausen syndrome by proxy, once obscure, entered ordinary conversation because of it. Nicholas Godejohn, the man who had actually wielded the knife, faced the case on far harsher terms. He took his case to trial, and in 2018 he was convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of Dee Dee Blanchard. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A jury had rejected any suggestion that he was merely a tool in someone else's plan and held him fully responsible for the killing he carried out. The split in outcomes mirrored a pattern seen in other cases of a daughter and a boyfriend, with the person who struck the fatal blows receiving the heaviest sentence and the daughter who set the plan in motion receiving a lesser one. Here, though, the years of documented abuse made the gap easier for the public to accept than in the cases driven by money or jealousy, because so many people who followed it came away believing that Gypsy had been a victim long before she was anything else. Godejohn remains in prison, serving that life term to this day, while the woman who set the plan in motion has been free since 2023, a contrast that has kept the case in argument ever since. What stays in the public record about Gypsy Rose Blanchard is a case that sits uneasily in every category. There is a murdered woman at the centre of it, Dee Dee Blanchard, and nothing about the abuse she inflicted changes the fact that she was stabbed to death in her bed at the direction of her own child. There is also the long, documented cruelty she carried out, the 2 decades in which she stole a daughter's health, her childhood, and her freedom for sympathy and money. Abuse so severe that experts pointed to it as a defining example of its kind. Gypsy served the majority of her sentence, and after roughly 85% of her 10-year term, she was granted parole and released at the end of December 2023, walking out of the Chillicothe Correctional Center in the small hours of the morning into a level of public attention almost no released prisoner has ever received. She became a recognizable public figure, the subject of documentaries and a television series, married and divorced, rebuilt a life on the outside, and in time started a family of her own. She spoke, after her release, of remorse for her mother's death, even as she described the abuse she had survived, and the public that had once raised money for a sick child now followed every step of the freed daughter's new life. By 2024, she had become one of the most recognizable figures to emerge from any American crime story of the decade. The community that had once raised money for a dying child had to reckon with the fact that the illness was never real, and that the mother they had pitied had been abusing the daughter all along. The little house built out of compassion became the scene of a murder that grew directly out of the lie the house had been built to support. Springfield was left to absorb a betrayal unlike the others in this account. A whole town's compassion turned, without its knowledge, into the fuel for a long deception. Gypsy Rose Blanchard's case is the most widely known of all the stories gathered here, and it remains the hardest to file away, because it refuses to let anyone hold a single, simple feeling about it. A woman is dead. A daughter was tortured for 20 years under the banner of love. Both of those things are true at once, and the case stands as the final and starkest version of the thread that runs through every story in this account. In each of them, the danger that destroyed a family did not come through the front door from outside. It was already in the house, raised at the same table, sleeping down the same hall, wearing the face of a daughter. These 10 homes were supposed to be the safest places the people in them would ever know, and each one became the place where a parent died at the hands of, or by the design of, the child they had raised. What every one of these cases leaves behind is the same quiet, terrible lesson, that the people closest to us hold a kind of trust that can be turned into a weapon, and that the record of what happened when it was, in each of these 10 families, is now permanent. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.